building upon our initial study from last week, an overview of Ecclesiastes and Solomon. I have to tell you that Solomon is one of my favorite, most interesting characters in the Bible, just because of his lineage, and what he asked for, and just his transparency and candor, being, of course, one of the wisest men in the world at the time. And of course, one of his greatest accomplishments was Solomon's temple, with King of Tyre and Hiram Abiff, and able to construct such a magnificent edifice that didn't last very long. It was destroyed, of course. But just the things he went through and the power and capabilities he had, and through Ecclesiastes, noted some things that we can definitely glean from, and certain advantages and blessings that we have that we'll be talking about later on in the comments regarding the Lord's Supper that Solomon had. So if you'll look at chapter 1, verses 12 through 18, just 6 verses, and we'll be basing our study on that this morning. It says, the teacher was king over Israel and Jerusalem, devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. What a heavy burden God has laid on men. Having seen all the things that are done under the sun, all of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is twisted cannot be straightened, what is lacking cannot be counted. I thought to myself, look, I have grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. A little bit of an anachronism there, some things that we would look at and go, well, he had all the wisdom in the world. But when you read his writings, he's got definite challenges and issues with that. When he transforms his great wisdom into folly, he says, and the more knowledge he has, created more grief. So on its surface, we look at that and go, that's odd. Why would the wisest man in the world, the one who had more knowledge than anyone, who God had given him everything related to wisdom and knowledge, and yet it was creating grief and challenges and sorrow? How does that make sense? If we had all the knowledge, if we had all the wisdom, would we be facing the same challenges that Solomon did? And we'll talk about that for a minute. One of the first questions we want to ask is, have we ever wondered what would we do if we could have anything we wanted? What did Solomon want? And he got it. What did he want? He wanted wisdom. That in itself initially was wise, because from there he gained what? Everything. Right? He didn't ask for power. He didn't ask for wealth. Right? He didn't ask for masses of armies. He said, grant me wisdom, because from that spawns everything else. I always thought that was interesting, is that just that connection there. Is because he wanted wisdom, he gained knowledge in order to gain everything else he wanted. And that eventually, historically we see, became part of his downfall. He relied on his own wisdom instead of God saying, I gave you this, listen to me. He was happy in his own wisdom and challenged everything that God was telling him to do. And God continued to bless him until at the point it couldn't work out. And he says in the first chapter here is that I'm saddened, I'm grief-stricken by all the knowledge I do have. Solomon had everything open to him, and that is why this book is so interesting. He tried everything in pursuit of meaning and fulfillment in his life. And we will look at that particular statement. He pursued everything he wanted. He gained everything that he wanted in this life. You see in verse 12 and verse 16, some people will discard that. They say, I don't want wisdom, I want riches, I want power. And then we see what is the trouble with gaining that. To understand what Solomon is and is not talking about when he discusses wisdom. So let's define that between the spiritual realm and the earthly realm. He's not talking about wisdom that comes as a gift from God. You see in James 1:5, but if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. Following in James 3:17, the wisdom from above is first pure, peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy, good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. Notice the first part of that. It says, the wisdom from above. Then preceding that in James 1 we talked about, we just read, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God. That is significant. That is a differentiator between Solomon's path and what James is talking about. What Solomon's talking about that was granted of God, that his track, his path, was human wisdom. And therein lies the difference. Therein is why he says, I am full of grief and anxiety. So they're related, but not necessarily identical. As Solomon says, in wisdom there's a lot of grief, and the more knowledge there is, there can be more pain. So we're going to talk about that. Solomon felt like, and sometimes perhaps we do, that when we gain wisdom and power, we can resolve all of life's problems, all life's challenges. And he saw that that was not going to work out. Same thing with when we talk about, some commentaries talk about, education's a wonderful thing. Education can help people achieve their goals, enlighten people, create knowledge, be beneficial to the community and the family. But education in itself does not guarantee success, as Solomon found out. Education is never the ultimate answer in itself, because as commentators say, you've got to look at the moral and spiritual nature of our being, not necessarily just gaining knowledge for sake of knowledge. Quote says, education can never be the ultimate answer to these problems because they are moral and spiritual in nature, and secular education is ill-prepared to address them and provide answers that God alone can provide. Another quote from a commentator, human wisdom only explores what takes place under the sun, as Solomon referred to. It does not touch our inner spiritual lives. We see in chapter 2, verse 13, that Solomon admits that such wisdom is not all bad, and it has certain advantages. I saw that wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. So in chapter 2, 13 and 14, Solomon says, knowledge and education is significant, it is purposeful, it is necessary. In chapter 7, 19, he says, wisdom strengthens a wise man more than 10 rulers who are in a city. And a longer verse in chapter 9, 13 through 16. Also this I came to see as wisdom under the sun, and it impressed me. There was a small city with few men in it, and a great king came to it, surrounded it, and constructed large siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor wise man, and he delivered the city by his wisdom. Yet no one remembered that poor man. So I said, wisdom is better than strength. But the wisdom of the poor man is despised, and his words are not heeded. So Solomon recognized that knowledge and wisdom do have purpose, but singularly they fall short. And that is not the ultimate solution for our problems in life, especially in a spiritual nature. When you see, look at chapter 1, verse 13 to 14, he's thinking about things that he says are under the sun. What is he talking about there? Okay, here on earth. It certainly makes sense, doesn't it? That's his phrase to describe things that are happening in life, our human condition. That is under our sun. That does not, Solomon says, touch our inner selves, our spiritual being. It is everything temporal, everything tangible. He says that wisdom, what he's found out, is wisdom of a temporal nature, although in itself can have advantages, can be beneficial, it does not connect us any closer to God. He says that, human wisdom can't change a lot. Chapter 1, verse 15, what is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. If you look at chapter 7, 23 through 25, I've tested all this with wisdom, and I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. What has been so remote and exceedingly mysterious, who can discover it? I directed my mind to know, to investigate, to seek wisdom and an explanation, and to know the evil of folly and the foolishness of madness. And in chapter 8, verses 16 through 17, when I gave my heart to know wisdom and to see the task which has been done on the earth, even though one should never sleep day or night, and I saw every work of God, I concluded that man cannot discover the work which has been done under the sun. Even though man should seek laboriously, he will not discover, and though the wise man should say, I know, he cannot discover. So he's seeing the intractable nature of wisdom and human nature and how it kind of relates and contradicts each other. God's wisdom is separate from wisdom that we have here on earth. Commentators say, in order to gain a realistic view of life, we have to know that distinction between human wisdom that Solomon had, which gained him power and strength and riches, versus the blessings that we have from God and his wisdom. Sometimes we may believe that an increase in wisdom or human knowledge is the answer to all our problems. So we continue to study, we read, we get on social media, we read all we can about a subject, and we may gain knowledge. It may help us in edifying ourselves and improving our lives and improving our families' lives and our community. But at what point do we have that self-realization that Solomon had when he said, this is folly? With that disconnect from God's wisdom. What does he want me to do? I can do all the study I want. I can get all the education I want. I can get all the degrees I want. But that's only going to lead me to a certain point. At some point, I've got to acknowledge I've got to have God's help to do this. And Solomon, through his wisdom, eventually gained that. But at some point, we see what happened historically with Solomon. That he didn't actually, in many cases, follow up on that. Chapter 1, verses 17 through 18. I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I realized This is also striving after wind, because in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. Why is he saying that? Again, we get back to that when you look at it on the surface. You have all this wisdom and knowledge, and here he is. He's getting, some would say, hey, Solomon, you're getting awfully dramatic here. You've got everything. How was he saying that all his knowledge and wisdom is resulting in grief and pain? Absolutely. Commentator said, Charles, increases in knowledge and wisdom make us more aware of the troubles and imperfections of this world. The more we know, the more we may realize we don't know. We're always seeking and exploring, and that's fine. But at some point, we have to realize is that, as Solomon did, there are more troubles, more imperfections than what we originally thought. That which fails to solve for us the problem of death solves nothing ultimately. That's kind of where Solomon is headed to. He had everything, but he saw that wisdom and knowledge was not going to fulfill everything that he was seeking. And that's why we look at, because we have the benefit of history and the New Testament, and seeing it and where that leads. When you look at Eve, what was her motivation? What was Satan dangling in front of her? Yeah, have the wisdom and knowledge, right? And what did she get? She wanted to be wise, know the distinction between good and evil. And sure enough, she became wise all right. And she became the victim of that experience. Be careful what you want. How much better off she and her entire human race would have been had she remained ignorant of evil. Quote from a commentator. So everything that Solomon had, all his wisdom and all his knowledge and power that he gained from that, was really negated when he realized that that didn't solve the ultimate problem. As he was getting more challenges to his power, as he was doing things that God did not want him to do, because even though he was wise and powerful and knowledgeable, he was realizing that ultimately everything was coming to naught. He realized the wise man, just like the unwise, faced the disappointment of death. He saw death imminent. He saw everything he had asked for, which generated all the power and wealth and relationships and empire building. And perhaps one of the greatest edifices and wonders of the world, even the temple, which he could not foresee was going to be destroyed. So he was very proud of it, but he knew that ultimately there was an issue that he could not get figured out. And you look at chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And I know that one fate befalls them both. Then I said to myself, as for the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? Why, Solomon? So I said to myself, this too is vanity. All this wisdom is vanity. For there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man, as with the fool, as inasmuch as the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die. The wisdom and knowledge he had asked for had revealed to him that ultimately we're all ending in the same place. The wisest man in the world was looking around and seeing the unwise and recognizing we still all have the same problem, the death problem, that even Solomon could not solve. That human wisdom cannot resolve the death problem for us because it cannot do nothing about the cause of death, which is what? Mm-hmm. Sin. Whether Solomon recognized that or used that term, that's exactly what it is. We talked about Eve earlier. That's where the issues lie. And that ultimately is what led to Solomon's despair, his frustration, his anxiety. He had all the wisdom in the world, but he couldn't save himself. No one could. And that's where the blessings we have, unlike Solomon. We know how to reconcile. We know how to resolve the death problem because we recognize what it is, that it's sin, and how we can overcome it. Chapter 2, verse 17. So I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after wind. One of the greatest characters, perhaps, in the Bible and historically. He said, I hated life. If those aren't powerful words to us, is that how someone who had so much control, everyone and everything at his beck and call, I hate life. That wisdom and knowledge was turning on him because he was seeing that he could not ultimately take care of the ultimate problem, the death problem. Mark? Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely. Very true. Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly. Yeah, that's part of what we wrestle with. Yeah, to be so wise, why are you having a problem with this? Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And we don't know fully what knowledge he did have related to the spiritual side of things. Maybe the human side of him, his human condition, did not allow him to seek that or recognize that. It is very interesting. It's something to ponder. Is it? How fully aware was he of the spiritual side? Right. Yeah, absolutely. Sure. The conclusion of the matter. Absolutely. So when he says in chapter 2, verse 17, that he hated life, again, Bernie, that's something we have to ultimately look at is that what all did he know and why didn't he act on it, or maybe he did at a later point, but we don't see that necessarily. When you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18 following, uh, we see that our greatest need for the wisdom of God, is from God and not our own. It says the word of the cross is to those who are perishing foolishness, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will set aside. Where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? The wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God. God was well pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. For indeed, Jews ask for signs and Greeks search for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. To Jews, a stumbling block, and to Gentiles, foolishness. But to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, the weakness of God is stronger than men. You see in verse 21, the world did not know God through earthly wisdom. God revealed himself in a way that we are definitely the benefactors of, which circumvents human wisdom. And that was what was causing issues, of course, with Solomon. He couldn't get beyond the earthly nature of things. The cross circumvented that. That God sent his son to die for our sins on the cross and gain that wisdom. 1 Corinthians 1:22-23, Paul said that many reject the cross because human wisdom keeps getting in the way. And commentators then bring up the point where we create an intellectual problem. Again, our human condition, which creates, we have all the knowledge, we have all the wisdom, we've got all these degrees, all these divinity and theology and all these other degrees. And so we have great academics and scholarly insight into things. And we're looking at the Bible and going, hey, we see some issues here. We see some challenges here. And of course, when we are confronted with that by people out in the world, is like, what about this? Or what about this? We're called upon to answer that. And we may have to do our own study. But ultimately, let's be sure we don't follow the path of Solomon and chase those things. He said it, so we'll hear, if there is a God, why is there suffering in the world? How could Jesus be both God and man? If God answers prayers, why are our prayers not answered? It may be difficult to answer some of these questions, and we can meet with people and try to do that. But again, that's what Solomon was focused on, trying to answer those problems on his own without seeking God's wisdom. I've got all the wisdom. I've got all the knowledge. I'll answer this myself, or I'll ask these questions without necessarily relying on God to answer them for us. Ultimately, Solomon said, I hate life. I can't get this figured out. So the idea may seem to be that if we can't answer all the questions, then maybe the gospel is not something we should pursue. And that is exactly what the devil's trying to do. Let's throw up all these incidental, minor little questions that really do not reveal anything in our spiritual path to seeking God and reconciling with Him. Yeah, Phil. Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's very interesting. The Dean of Divinity was no longer a believer. He may have had some of the thoughts that Solomon had. Thank you for sharing that. So we may not have all the answers. These are weighty questions. We may not have all the answers. Uh, God has revealed to us that we know the efficacy and the confirmation of what the Bible is, and that we have eternity. And that Solomon kept going, facing that. Of course, he didn't have Jesus at the time, but it was all in God's plan. And like Phil said, with the dean of the divinity school, who eventually, because of his wisdom and his knowledge, concluded, perhaps there's no God. How are you the dean of a divinity school otherwise? So we see that goes on today, is that we pursue our own knowledge and our own purposes and our own education. That does not contravene what Christ has done for us. He was born, He taught, He died on the cross to save us for our sins. And that there's a great commission following. And that's what we live under today. And that we have the wonderful blessings of that. We have to be so careful that because God has given us, wisdom and knowledge to pursue everything, and the technology is amazing. The technology which is replicating itself faster than we can ever imagine, the things that are being advanced. And that the ways that we as Christians can use that technology. But we see how that technology is taking a life of its own. And how Solomon, from the grave, is looking like, what's going on? Knowledge and power and wisdom in pursuit in a vacuum is not going to work out. Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's astounding, isn't it? When we see with Solomon, in his pursuit of greater wisdom and knowledge, when we have the benefit of looking back at what Christ has done for us, if Solomon just had the wisdom of mercy, truth, love, forgiveness, humility, how much better off he would be. Would he be saying, I hate life, if he had just pursued God's wisdom instead of that of his own? 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 24 and 25. We look at and it says, does God call for a rejection of all human knowledge? Of course not. Look at what we've gained, but we have to recognize that it is all because of God's purpose. and His capabilities in giving us knowledge and wisdom. Our advances in medicine, I was thinking earlier today, just of the crisis that I don't want to say we've concluded, it may be with us for quite some time, but just the advances in medical science, right? And how the calamity, where we were a year ago, we were going, oh my word, God help us. What's going to happen? How are we going to get out of this? Vaccinations, boosters, everything else, and advances in other sciences with cancer, and how we're looking at things in a different way and able to improve the human condition. That does not negate the spiritual wisdom that we need to be seeking. So in no way does God call for rejection of human knowledge. He wants us to be the best and most comfortable, because the better we are, the healthier we are, the better capacity we have, we can help others, right? We can share the gospel with others. But we have to acknowledge, as we see in Corinthians, that His knowledge is greater, His power is better, and through the message of Christ we can gain that wisdom, and peace with Him, and eternal life in heaven, the things we need. So to conclude, and then we'll open up for any questions or comments. Solomon looked at all his options in exploring the meaning of life. What he did not have, an amazing opportunity that we can't even put in words, is to know Christ. So he was in despair. He was in frustration. We have access that he did not necessarily have. And we need to recognize that and be aware of that. We have an opportunity that even the greatest, wisest, most powerful, most knowledgeable person that some describe on earth, named Solomon, did not have. And here we do have. And that's accepting Christ and recognizing the blessings we have with the sacrifice that Jesus made. Because we do not want to be looking in the mirror as Solomon did, with grief and despair, and say, I've got all this around me, but I don't like it. We need to be taking Solomon's lessons and applying and going, yeah, because we've got some amazing blessings. We've got Christ to take care of it. All right. Thank you for your comments. Any final questions or comments or anything? All right, great. That was an early bell. I'll let you go early. A couple of minutes. Thank y'all. God bless.